Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Edward's on this lovely evening. We are delighted. Oh, excuse me, just get my notes here. We are delighted to welcome Professor Richard Rex with us this evening, one of the foremost experts on Robert Barnes and this early Reformation period, its connection with Luther and Lutheranism. Richard is the professor of history, of Reformation history, and the Polkinghorne Fellow in Theology and Religious Studies at Queen's College. He's written many significant books on the Reformation, including The Making of Martin Luther, but most recently his Henry VIII and Martin Luther II controversy. And he is going to be speaking to us on Robert Barnes and the Reformation tonight. But I just draw your attention, for those of you who don't know, 500 years ago on Christmas Eve, the midnight mass, Robert Barnes stood from this very pulpit, Latimer's pulpit, and preached. We don't have a copy of his sermon, but I just went through his 1931 articles in which he goes back and talks about some of the things in his sermon, but I'm sure that Richard will give us a lot of that in his talk, so I won't bore you with that. Just to say, the only other notice is, please do stay after. After Richard's talk, we'll have a time for Q&A, but then also can I direct your attention to, we have a whole weekend of celebration or commemoration of Barnes, and this is the Christianity and Social Change 500 years of the Reformation in Britain. And so at Trinity Hall tomorrow, it is free and open to all. At 2 p.m. there will be a lecture from Professor Jonathan Schultz, 3 p.m. Professor Martin Daunton, and 4 p.m. Professor Nigel Bigger. So anybody who's interested in some Saturday afternoon fun, please do speak to Robert, or just you can look, there's a lovely QR code there. Tomorrow night, we have Professor Alec Ryrie coming from Durham, but unfortunately, if you haven't gotten a ticket for that event, they are already sold out. You may try to come to the door and you may be able to get in. I just can't promise that you will. But if you would like to come and join us to hear Alec Ryrie, he will be preaching here on Sunday morning for our for our Eucharistic service at 11 a.m. So I will leave this at the out near the west door, so please do sign up for this if you'd like. And can we welcome Professor Richard Rex?
Thank you very much, Mark. Foremost experts, I think perhaps one of, at most, 4 experts on Robert Barnes is probably a more just comment. Myself, Alec Ryrie, Corey Mars, and Carl Truman, I think, of whom I'm probably the least. Long ago, when I first arrived in this university, there was a notice board outside this church, facing, as it were, down that way, giving the history in a nutshell. Sadly, I can't remember its precise wording, which struck me every time I saw it as delightfully, though unintentionally, humorous. Its message was that a Christian church had stood on this site for a millennium or more, and that the gospel was first preached here in 1525. I'd always wondered what the person who drafted that message thought had been going on for the previous 5 centuries. And if anyone has a photograph of that old sign, which was here in the 80s and into the 90s, not the more recent ones, do send me a copy. I'd love to have the precise words. The claim about the first preaching of the gospel was, of course, a reference to the reason we're here this evening and for the events going on here in Trinity Hall this weekend. Christmas Eve, 1525, saw a sermon given here by Robert Barnes, prior of the Cambridge Austin Friars, which was just a little bit over that way next to Corpus Christi, between there and the present Corn Exchange. That site was excavated, of course, as a few of you may remember, a few years ago, so you could see the footings of the priory buildings for a while. Well, that sermon, which was a Christmas Eve sermon, it was the 4th Sunday of Advent, not midnight mass, in fact, as it were, resulted in Barnes's arrest, a hearing in Cambridge, a hearing in London, a recantation, imprisonment, escape, flight to Europe, a journey, in fact, which took Barnes ultimately to Luther's Wittenberg 2 or 3 years later, where, under the pseudonym of Antonius Anglus, Anthony English, he became a disciple and a friend of Luther himself, and a published author. Now, Robert Barnes's Christmas Eve sermon is the episode with which John Foxe, in his justly famous Book of Martyrs, begins his account of the early Reformation movement in Cambridge. He introduces Barnes as a Cambridge theologian who, having gone to study for a time in Louvain, returned to display a marked inclination to the study of the scriptures along the new lines, not of Luther, but of Erasmus and the Renaissance humanists. But he still pursued the traditional path of disputations to earn his degree of Doctor of Divinity. And according to Foxe, the first exam he ever presided over as a Doctor of Divinity was the Bachelor of Divinity exam for one George Stafford, himself to be known very soon afterwards as one of Cambridge's leading early Protestants. It was this disputation that brought Barnes to the attention of Thomas Bilney, a fellow of Trinity Hall, who was the person at the very centre of the new Cambridge interest in what people at the time called the New Learning. That is, the challenging new theological interpretations emanating from Luther and Wittenberg. As a result of that, and there's going to be a bit of quotation from John Foxe here and there, as a result of that, says Foxe, what with his reading, disputation and preaching, Barnes became marvellous mighty in the scriptures, preached sore ever against bishops and hypocrites, and yet did not see his inward and outward idolatry that he both taught and maintained. He's still a Catholic. Until that good man, Master Bilney, with others, converted him wholly unto Christ. In a later edition of his work, Foxe adds who the others were. Bilney was assisted by George Stafford, John Thickstill, both of Pembroke Hall, Thomas Arthur of St. John's, as well as 4 fellows of Bennett College, which is what they used to call Corpus Christi, who included Matthew Parker. Only then does Foxe get to the point that brings us here today. After his conversion, and the first sermon that ever he preached of this truth was the Sunday before Christmas Day, but it happened to be Christmas Eve, at St. Edward's Church, belonging to Trinity Hall in Cambridge, by the Peas Market, whose theme was the epistle of the same Sunday, Gaudete in Domino. And so he postilled, an old word commentated on, he postilled the whole epistle, following the scripture and Luther's postil. And for that sermon, he was immediately accused of heresy by 2 fellows of the King's Hall. Now, sadly, as Mark indicated, we don't have the text of the sermon Barnes preached. What we do know about it comes from his own subsequent account of the events, written in 1531, so it's 5 or 6 years later, under the title of A Supplication made by Robert Barnes, Doctor of Divinity, unto the most excellent and redoubted Prince, King Henry VIII. And this work listed the 25 articles, gobbets, whatever you want to call them, that had been taken down by accusers, no doubt sitting there just like Mark now, pen in hand, scribbling away in their notebooks as the unfortunate preacher proceeded. So in this text, he gives us the text of his 25 articles and offers various elucidations of them. Now, it's at this point that Foxe started one of the longest-running hairs of the English Reformation. And if you'll forgive the continuing mixed metaphor, he started the myth of the White Horse. That is, the White Horse Inn, a hostelry as famous in the annals of the English Reformation as the Eagle in the annals of DNA. Then, writes Foxe, immediately after the sermon, the secret learned in Christ, both of Pembroke Hall, St. John's, Peterhouse, Queen's, King's, Gonville Hall and Bennet College showed themselves and flocked together in open sight, in the schools and at sermons, at St. Mary's, at the Austins and at the disputations. And they conferred continually together, and the house they resorted to most commonly was the White Horse, which, for spite of them, to bring God's word into contempt, was called Germany. And that house was chosen because them of St. John's, the King's and the Queen's colleges came in on the backside, which was what they called the backs in the 16th century. For then much trouble began to ensue, for his accusers accused him, who? In the Regent House before the Vice-Chancellor. Now this is the only reference in any authentic source to this famous White Horse Inn. And I won't bore you with the endless embroidery which has been worked around this solitary allusion in the intervening 5 centuries. But I shall share with you my suspicion, to mix a few more metaphors, that the White Horse is one of history's great red herrings, or at least wild geese. There's obviously something to it. Fox does not, for the most part, simply make stuff up. But he does mix stuff up, particularly in chronology. And in this case, that aside about the White Horse, by the way, this is new, this is kind of like me working on this week. This aside about the White Horse even reads like a clumsy insertion into the text. In the second edition of Fox's book, the first edition was 1563, the second, 1570. In the second edition, the aside about the White Horse is now ended with a full stop at came in on the backside, full stop. And then a new sentence starts. At this time, much trouble began to ensue. The adversaries of Dr. Barnes accused him in the Regent House before the Vice-Chancellor. Somebody resetting the text has realised that it doesn't make sense as it stands. So he's tidied it up, sorted it out, and moved on. If we cut out the White Horse, what we'd be left with in the first edition is blah, blah, blah. For that sermon, he was immediately accused of heresy by 2 fellows of the King's Hall. For then much trouble began to ensue, for his accusers accused him in the Regent House before the Vice-Chancellor. Totally smooth, makes perfect sense. Fox had some information about the White Horse, that's clear, and he levers it in here, he crowbars it in, because he's got to put it somewhere. It's, what do we call that? You know, it's damned well going in, the motto of the PhD student through the ages. I know it, it goes in. Now this matters. It matters, actually, because as Fox tells it, Barnes's sermon was a clarion call that stirred the early Protestants of Cambridge into instant vocal and visible action. But this doesn't sit well with what we know from Barnes's own account. In the 25 articles alleged against him, as has often been pointed out, it's difficult to pick out any clear evidence of heresy. Almost all the articles are criticisms of clerical behaviour, pomp, greed, avarice, whatever. The very first article, and the comment made on it by the Chancellor of Cambridge University, John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, at Barnes's hearing before the bishops in Westminster a few weeks later, the very first article illustrates this. Quotes, "If you believe you are more bound to serve God tomorrow, which is Christmas Day, or on Easter Day, or on Whit Sunday, for any holiness that is in the day, you are no faithful Christian man, but superstitious." And as Barnes notes, Fisher himself, who'd already published 3 books against Martin Luther, acknowledged that this didn't amount to much. Briefly, my Lord of Rochester allowed this article, saying he wouldn't condemn it for £100. But it was foolishly said to preach this before the butchers of Cambridge. You know, it was not the sort of thing you talk about before the children. It's the kind of thing we might discuss in Latin in the disputations. Now, what Barnes had said in this church, from presumably this pulpit, though I don't know, has it ever been dendrochronologically dated? Do we know? Yeah, indeed. I mean, it looks to me as though it is authentically probably the one that always stood here. I've always assumed so. What Barnes said was unarguably true, but obviously tendentious and deliberately shocking. What the articles show us is that Barnes was setting out to annoy people, presumably the people who were there at the sermon scribbling down notes. And this gives us important clues about what Barnes was really doing and about what was actually going on in Cambridge at that time. It was all a bit more complicated, but also a lot more human than Fox makes out. One or two of the other articles will make the point. The second one, nowadays, no man dares preach the true and the very gospel of God, especially if they're feeble and fearful. But I trust and pray to God that it may shortly come that false and manifest errors may be plainly showed. And again, Article 5, this pleading in judgment, he's now criticizing litigiousness, this pleading in judgment is manifestly against the gospel. Now, Barnes's use of the word gospel is subtle and revealing. At one level, the word's entirely innocent. In medieval English, gospel means one of the four narratives of Jesus' life, or a reading from one of them in a church service. Its use in Barnes's sense here as a general term for the core Christian message of Scripture, that meaning is emphatically a creation of the Protestant Reformation, as a perusal of the relevant entry in the Oxford English Dictionary will confirm. But, so what he's doing is signalling his allegiance without actually saying anything that can be acted on. Article 3, we make nowadays many martyrs. I trust we shall have many more shortly, for the truth could never be preached plainly, but persecution did follow. And this was really provocative. John Clarke, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, rose to the bait a few weeks later and asked, do you mean that the Austin friars burned for heresy at Bruges in 1523 were martyrs? And Barnes dodges the question by saying, I have no idea why they were put to death. Disingenuous, obviously. The executions of Henry of Zutphen and the other Austin friars at Bruges in 1523 attracted attention across the Netherlands and across Europe. Luther wrote a pamphlet about it. Another Cambridge man in Louvain at the time, Nicholas Darrington of St. John's College, wrote a letter back to his friends at John's telling them about it. Of course he knew. And again, he did not pray for the three estates of Holy Church, neither made he his prayers at the beginning of the sermon, according to the old custom, but at the end, and making no prayer to Our Lady, nor for the souls in purgatory. So omitting the customary prayers to the Virgin or for the dead is again an obvious signal, a teasing signal. But you're not obliged on any given moment to pray to Our Lady or to pray for the souls of the departed. No heresy here, nothing to see, move on, move on. Barnes is treading carefully. He's delivering strong stuff, sending out clear signals, and very carefully avoiding treading on any actual mines. There's nothing there that they can get him on. It's also evident that Barnes's intentions were advertised beforehand. From his account, we know that his audience included prominent academics. It certainly included Dr. Robert Ridley, the uncle of the famous Nicholas Ridley, the Protestant bishop and martyr. It included Dr. Walter Preston, Mr. Thomas Tyrrell, Mr. Edward Fooke, Mr. John Puregold. Dr. John Watson was probably there as well. Ridley, Preston and Tyrrell were the men who actually wrote down the articles to accuse Barnes with. But why were they here in St. Edward's Church on Christmas Eve 1525? Well, they're here because they know what's going down. Clearly messages have been sent out. The accusers are worth a quick look. Ridley and Tyrrell were the two fellows of King's Hall. Preston and Fooke, fellows of Christ's. John Watson one of the grand old men of the university, was at various times a fellow of Peterhouse, John's, and King's Hall, and Master of Christ's College. Some of those at the same time. I'm not quite sure how that worked. Ridley was a consistent, probably the most important opponent of the Reformation in Cambridge in those years. In 1521, along with Dr. Watson and a couple of others, he'd been sent down to Westminster by the university as an official delegation to help the king and Cardinal Wolsey plan out, as it were, their response to the teachings of Martin Luther. This group helped King Henry finish his famous book against Luther, The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments. Ridley was a cousin of the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, and was soon to become his secretary. In that capacity, he took part in numerous proceedings against heretics in London in the later 1520s. He wrote a short critique of Tyndale's New Testament translation. He was a genuine scholar. He followed his patron, Cuthbert Tunstall, to when Tunstall became Bishop of Durham in 1530, and his sizable collection of books, most of which he busily annotated, he was obviously a very busy note-taker, survives in what was the library of Usherall College and is now part of the collection of Durham University. And indeed, in his memory, I will just note that one book he annotated got him into big trouble. It was a defense of Henry VIII's royal supremacy. And Bishop Tunstall's palace was raided by Henry VIII's men in 1534, and Ridley's study was searched, and they found the copy of this book with Ridley's hostile, critical annotations on it. He was promptly arrested, and at that point disappears from the historical record. He's never seen again, presumably died in captivity. Now, Robert Barnes, as Fox indicates, was a follower of Erasmus before he became a follower of Luther. And the path from Erasmian scholarship to Lutheran or Protestant theology was well trodden at that time, not least, perhaps most famously, by Philip Melanchthon. But it's important to understand that not all the Erasmians and not all the humanists ended up as Lutherans or Reformers. Ridley was a friend and correspondent of Polydore Virgil, an expatriate Italian humanist scholar, probably second only to Erasmus in fame in the 1520s. Dr. Watson had been one of Erasmus's personal friends at Cambridge in the 1510s, when Erasmus was, of course, living in my own college, Queen's. Thanks to Fox's little story about the White Horse, there's long been a sense that Cambridge was from the start peculiarly receptive to the Protestant Reformation. Yet Fox's own account also reveals the depth of hostility to it. As he says, much trouble began to ensue. Fox is a wonderful witness because he sees things so entirely through one set of eyes that he can't even see the other meanings in the things he reports. So he's a lot of the time wonderfully, as it were, uncritical. Thank goodness, it makes his evidence much more valuable. The White Horse was called Germany, he says, out of spite for the Reformation sympathizers. Yes, there were people around who didn't like it. There were many Cambridge scholars, even Erasmians and humanists, who opposed Luther: Henry Gold, Humphrey Walkden, Henry Bullock, Robert Wakefield, the first professor of Hebrew, Richard Crook, the first, or perhaps second professor of Greek, Ralph Baines, and many more. The Reformation here, as in most places, was a divisive process. Equally, though, it's sometimes been argued, and particularly frequently recently, that at Christmas 1525, Barnes's own theological views are nothing more than a kind of moderate ecclesiastical reformism. As I hope I've already indicated, I think that's obviously not true, even though it is true that he said nothing openly heretical. The idea that his trouble would be explained because he was an Erasmian critic of the church simply makes no sense at all. and we can show that it's not correct. Dr. John Watson, in a private letter, which survives in the archives of John's, Dr. John Watson criticised Cardinal Wolsey back in 1519, saying that papal legates like Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio, who was in England at the time, were, and I quote, satraps who live in such a style that no amount of money could possibly cover their expenses. Robert Ridley had a row with Cardinal Wolsey face to face in Blackfriars in 1529 over Henry VIII's divorce. Ridley was a little man and sort of stood up and gave it to Wolsey before being cleared from the hall. Barnes himself recalled how Ridley had privately described England's bishops as, and I quote, and I love the phrase because it's still with us today, as, quotes, clear out of order. He said it's clear out of order in a Cambridge conversation, not in the White Horse, but in the house of Dr. William Butts, a former student of Gonville Hall who took a doctorate in medicine in 1518 and went on to become one of England's leading physicians. He became physician to Henry VIII in the end, chief physician in the end. And in fact was one of the key behind-the-scenes figures of the English Reformation. But the glimpse of Barnes and Ridley in friendly conversation in William Butts's house opens our eyes to the effect of the Reformation in Cambridge. It's not that it divided the sheep from the goats, the up-to-date fashionable scholars from the old-fashioned fuddy-duddies. It divided the fashionable scholars among themselves. But incidentally, was probably also part of Cambridge's evangelical circle. Just a couple of years after this, in 1528, he was already in the service of Henry VIII. He was sent to Hever Castle in Kent to look after Anne Boleyn, who was afflicted with the sweat, as they called it, a Tudor viral infection, latterly made famous from the Wolf Hall series of novels by someone I refer to as she who must not be named. The sweat, a viral infection with a lethality far in excess of COVID-19. It was expected she would die. While he was there looking after her and he brought her back to health, he lobbied her to intervene with the Cardinal Wolsey on behalf of Dr. Thomas Farmer, the president of Queen's College, absentee president. In the 16th century, we of Queen's College preferred our presidents not to live in college. It also meant we only had to pay them half the salary. But Dr. Thomas Farmer, who was also a rector in London, who was at that moment in the Bishop of London's prison facing charges of heresy. And here's Butts interceding with the king's intended bride on his behalf. But to return to Barnes and the story, we also have to doubt the other dimension of Fox's White Horse story, that Cambridge's Protestants are inspired by Barnes to come out, as it were. We should doubt it, first of all, because as I've just shown you, even Barnes himself is hardly coming out into the open. I mean, he's sending out signals, but he's not laying down the law. And secondly, we should doubt it because no one else in Cambridge got into trouble in 1525 or 1526. About a week after Christmas, Barnes was brought before the Vice-Chancellor, who concluded there was no heresy in his remarks, but a statement was drafted for Barnes to sign, a kind of, sort of, let's solve the problem and bury it sort of statement. Barnes took it away, and he says he consulted a group of about 10 people about whether or not he could sign it. We can be confident that these are probably the same people who brought about his conversion. He names George Stafford and Thomas Bilney, and he names them because they're dead. He says the rest are still alive. He's out of the country. They're still in Cambridge. He doesn't want to put them at risk. They advised Barnes not to sign, so he didn't. As a result of that, the stalemate was broken when a royal official was sent from Westminster to arrest him, and take him down to Westminster for further questioning. Nobody else was summoned from Cambridge to London. If people had been flocking and demonstrating their Protestant sympathies, they undoubtedly would have been. If Barnes's opponents had seen other dons behaving like Barnes, there would have been many more summonses. So my inference here is that the White Horse story is Fox inserting something into the 1520s that, well, I think, but I can't prove it, probably dates from 10 years later. But we could talk about that later. And that's only an opinion. It's not a fact. I can't prove it. I think I can prove that the story doesn't belong where we find it. Well, Barnes was... Oh, hang on, I've just lost a page. Where are we? Oops. Ah, yes. Barnes was brought to London, where, he tells us, no definite heresy was proven against him. This, in fact, is not strictly true, because on Sunday, the 11th of February, 1526, at Paul's Cross, outside the cathedral in London, he read out a recantation. Again, we don't know what it said, but he must have been recanting something. And I think I can now identify what that was. Among the audience at Barnes's sermon was a particularly intriguing man, Mr. John Puregold. I love the name. Mr. John Puregold, Bachelor of Civil Law and Fellow of Trinity Hall. And he was sympathetic to Barnes. And after Barnes's arrest, Puregold wrote a letter on his behalf to the Master of Trinity Hall, Dr. Stephen Gardiner. Sounds as though Trinity Hall also liked absentee presidents or masters, because Gardiner was by this time on the staff of Cardinal Wolsey down in Westminster. And Puregold writes to Gardiner saying there was nothing really wrong about the sermon. Years later, Gardiner recalled that at this point he was still on friendly terms with Barnes and, I quote, saw no malice in him. So he intervened to do what he could. And incidentally, he notes that the Dr. Walter Preston of Christ's, who'd been at the sermon busily taking notes, was someone, quotes, whom Barnes could not bear. There are obviously personal rivalries and jealousies at work in these events. But even more helpfully, Gardiner says he went to see Barnes in custody to talk him round, because everything would have been easily pardoned if Barnes had not madly persisted in the Anabaptists' opinion, denying lawsuits to be lawful among Christian men. And that is one of Barnes's articles. And the risk of that one was it was actually a directly challengeable statement. And I laboured with Barnes secretly to bring that idea out of his head, whereupon he yielded to me when I showed him a saying of St. Augustine expounding the text of Scripture from which Barnes took his error, so that afterwards Barnes was content to abjure his opinion. It must have been this one little article, which is barely a line in the 25, that Barnes was, as it were, caught on. Now, one can hardly imagine a more inflexible Catholic than Stephen Gardiner, yet he's perfectly happy to intervene to help a friend in trouble for heresy that he doesn't think he really means. John Puregold, likewise, an impeccable Catholic. He died about a year later, and his will survives. A will from early 1527. It abounds in donations for prayers for his soul, 20 shillings for the high altar in this church, donations to local guilds, including the guild in the Austin Friars, candles before the image of St. Saviour in this church. I wonder where that, and indeed what that was. Doles of bread for the poor, a commemoration in Trinity Hall, and most fascinatingly, burial in this church, and he specifies the place. Burial in this church fellow at Trinity Hall, beside my first wife. This is Joan, his first. And he mentions both his wife. He was a doubly widowed man who was subsequently elected a fellow of Trinity Hall. And a fascinating backstory, I think, for the time. But Pure Gold, like Gardiner, shows us that in these early years of Reformation agitation, boundaries are not yet firmly drawn, loyalties are not yet crystal clear. Recantation, however, did not, for Barnes, mean rehabilitation. He was kept in custody, immured in the Austin Friars in London. The precincts of the Austin Friars, still marked by a street name, are just a little bit off Broad Street. And the Austin Friars indeed would later become the home of Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who basically just took it over. Despite his captivity, Barnes became involved with the trade in forbidden books, Protestant books, in London. He sold a copy of Tyndale's New Testament to a man who came in from the country in Essex. This involvement led to him being rusticated. He was sent off to the Austin Friars in Northampton in 1528, and it was from there that he disappeared the same year, rather in the manner of John Stonehouse or perhaps Reginald Perrin, leaving his religious habit neatly folded on the riverbank, together with a note telling people to search for his body because it had another letter on it addressed to Cardinal Wolsey. In the meantime, he fled to the Netherlands and made his way to Wittenberg, where he became a friend and disciple of Luther. Now, when Barnes fled the country, he could scarcely have imagined what would unfold over the next 10 years, as Henry pursued relentlessly his divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But it turned out that Barnes's removal to Wittenberg seemed to offer an opportunity to the government. In 1531, feelers were put out, Barnes was approached. Find out what Luther thinks, see if you can get Luther on side over the divorce. Sadly, for Barnes, he was unable to do this. Luther took one look at the whole issue and said, this is all nonsense. You know, the king's married to Catherine of Aragon, there's an end of it. And just brushed the whole thing aside. Nonetheless, Barnes himself indicated that he was more favourable. It's at that point that he wrote his supplication, his defence of himself from 1526, in an attempt to justify himself to the king and win his way back into favour. He was invited to return unofficially to England on a safe conduct at the end of that year, much to the annoyance of Henry's Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, who had men literally keeping Barnes under constant surveillance for the entirety of his brief stay. More made sure that Barnes knew he was being watched, as it were. Over the next few years, Barnes is employed intermittently in attempts to build connections between London and Wittenberg, between especially after 1534, the autonomous Church of England and the Lutheran churches of Germany. And this is actually where, to move away from Cambridge, the ultimate significance of Barnes's life lies. And in a sense, it's a tale of failure or might have been. For Barnes represents, more than any other one individual, the path not taken by the English Reformation. For Barnes was a Lutheran, an absolute die-cast, 100% loyal Lutheran. And a Lutheran Reformation seemed in every way to many observers in the 1530s the obvious outcome of the process Henry VIII was initiating. In the 1520s, Martin Luther, in the wake of the Peasants' War in Germany, had worked out a new political theology to accompany his interpretation of the gospel. And it's the political theology that in the 17th century would be called in England the divine right of kings. It was predicated on the fourth of the Ten Commandments, honour your father and mother. I'm using the numbering of the fourth because that's the numbering of the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. Of course, the fifth commandment, according to the enumeration then later preferred by the Church of England. But that commandment Luther's interpretation of that commandment identifies kings as the fathers of their nations, a role which entitles them to absolute obedience and which insulates them from any accountability and protects them entirely from any possibility of lawful, active resistance. It's a wonderfully appealing patriarchal political authority, which Luther sees simply restated by Peter and Paul in their epistles. And it's a theory which Barnes sets out in the preface of his supplication to Henry VIII in 1531. And there is, in the mid-1530s, in the English story, a sort of Lutheran moment. There's not a Lutheran phase. The Church of England never became Lutheran. But there's a Lutheran moment there. Henry's break with Rome led him immediately to moderate pressure on English evangelical or Lutheran or Protestant or Reformed theologians, whatever you want to call them. He'd campaigned remorselessly against them for 10 years, arresting them, burning several, driving them out of the country, burning their books. And yet suddenly, known Protestant sympathizers, several of whom had had to make public recantations of their beliefs, are now licensed to be preachers of the king, to take the message of the royal supremacy throughout the land. Because those who want religious change can see that the break with Rome is the one chink of light that they can pursue to achieve it. And this happens although Henry had committed himself publicly against Luther and his teachings for a decade or more. If he'd committed himself publicly to the cause of the papacy since 1512, supporting the papacy in every political conflict it was in, and then in the theological conflicts as well. As late as 1527, Henry had published a pamphlet under his own name in which he acknowledged that he knew how far the state of a king is inferior to the state of a pope. And yet by 1534, he's dismissing the usurped power and jurisdiction of someone he now knows only as the Bishop of Rome. He actually bans the use of the word pope in England. English preachers, encouraged by this, were already openly challenging doctrines and practices like purgatory and indulgences. Nothing central, but chipping, as it were, around the outer works. The doctrines that depended very obviously on papal authority. Now, we know that England was not to become a Lutheran nation, but who could have known that in 1534? If Henry could change his mind on the papacy, who could say what further doctrinal reversal might not be possible if his eyes were opened to another hidden truth within the Word of God? His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, certainly saw alignment with Lutheranism as the way forward. So in 1535, he encouraged the printing of the first complete English Bible in Antwerp, done by a friend of Robert Barnes, Miles Coverdale, who'd been a student under Barnes in the Austin Friary just over there. One of Cromwell's aides, Richard Taverner, translates the Lutheran founding document, the Confession of Augsburg, into English, along with Philip Melanchthon's explanation of it, and prints it in England on Cromwell's orders in 1536. There's no doubt that Cromwell realizes that a Lutheran Reformation offers the best way to buttress and anchor the royal supremacy. So there's a window of opportunity there, and Barnes is used to try and open it further. In 1535, he's sent back to Germany again on royal business. His mission to persuade Philip Melanchthon one, not to go to France, where the French king has invited him, but two, instead, to accept an invitation to England to meet Henry VIII. Well, he was successful in the first, but not the second. Melanchthon didn't go to France, but he didn't come to England either. Wise man. That would have been interesting. Melanchthon was the sort of guy, as Churchill said, of someone who always bore the impress of whoever's last sat upon him. And it would have been interesting to see what became of Melanchthon had he been sat on by Henry VIII. He'd probably become Archbishop of York or something. Anyway, the problem was that when the embassy gets to Wittenberg, what's the first item on the agenda? Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. She's now dead and in her grave. But still, Henry VIII wants everyone to agree he was right. And still Luther and the boys won't quite do that. No wonder, as Luther later recalled, Barnes left on this occasion without saying goodbye. The England to which Barnes returned in spring 1536, however, was a very different place to the one he left in autumn 1535. Catherine's death was followed by the sudden and unlooked-for disgrace of Anne Boleyn and her almost immediate execution. The Scottish Lutheran, or a Scottish Lutheran I should say, Alexander Alice, who was in the service of Thomas Cromwell at court, wrote to tell Luther that the new queen, Jane Seymour, was an enemy of the gospel, and that Barnes was having to lie low and keep quiet. Barnes himself at this point begged Thomas Cromwell, a little tactlessly perhaps, to get for him a job, the mastership of the Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, in London. It was worth £40 a year. He wanted him to get that for him because it had just been vacated by George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, who had been executed along with his sister that May. But Cromwell was unable to get anything for Barnes. By the end of the year, Barnes was in serious financial trouble. He couldn't even get paid for his expenses incurred on his diplomatic work. He made a brief public appearance, unwisely, on the 16th of November, 1536, to preach at the funeral of a rather interesting man, Robert Packington, a citizen of London, a good friend of Thomas Cromwell's, who'd been murdered on his way to Mass on Monday the 13th of November, 1536. Packington was the first man in English history to be murdered with a handgun. I mean, he was literally walking to church and someone just walked up behind him, shot him and moved away. At the time, they never found out who it was. Later they did. He really was a Protestant sympathizer. His will, no mention of the saints, no prayers for the dead, only handsome donations for poor relief, a request for a sermon, which Barnes gave, and a gift of money to one of London's leading Protestants, Dr. Edward Croom, another Cambridge Protestant, by the way. But the day after that, Barnes has appeared in public. He's promptly arrested by the man who's supposed to be paying his expenses, the Royal Treasurer, John Gostwick, who just throws him in the Tower of London. It seems if you were a royal official, you could get away with a lot in those days. Barnes is stewing in the Tower for the next 5 or 6 months. News of this even reaches Luther and Melanchthon in Wittenberg. Ooh, some loss of order of papers there. Now I've got it. He eventually gets out. Barnes eventually manages to get him out. But Barnes is continuing to depend entirely on Cromwell and to work for him as a preacher, but is finding life ever more difficult. Henry's own increasingly inflexible commitment once more to the traditional 7 sacraments. There might have been a wobble in the mid-1530s, hardens and hardens. He becomes more and more small c Catholic as the 1530s go on. Alignment with Lutheranism becomes less and less politically credible. Barnes becomes less and less important. when a power struggle broke out on Henry VIII's council in early 1540, it resulted in the fall of Cromwell himself, arrested, condemned, executed in the usual sort of tick-tock process of Henry VIII's court. Barnes was left out in the open, imprisoned himself in the Tower, and within weeks was condemned with two other Protestant preachers, Thomas Garrett and William Jerram, condemned not by a judicial hearing, but by an act of Parliament, simply declaring them heretics, and was taken to be burned at Smithfield on the 30th of July, 1540, in one of the most bizarre execution ceremonies, even of the reign of Henry VIII, which specialised in bizarre execution ceremonies. More details of that if you want another time. But even as Barnes, Garrett and Jerram were undergoing the torment of burning alive at Smithfield, they were able at least to look across the market square to where three long-standing Catholic opponents of the royal supremacy, Edward Powell, Thomas Abel and Richard Featherstone, men who'd been in the Tower of London so long that I think they'd literally been forgotten about, were at the very same moment being hanged, disemboweled and butchered while fully conscious. This gory display of ecumenical atrocity was later commemorated in a little pamphlet poem. It actually reads rather like a modern rap, printed under the title, one can see the inspiration, The Meeting of Dr. Barnes and Dr. Powell at Paradise Gate. The Meeting of Barnes and Powell at Paradise Gate. The copy that survives is from 1548 and has a little mention of Edward VI on its last leaf, but it was clearly first done in 1540 when it would have been topical and have meant something. And it opens with, as you might guess, Powell and Barnes sort of bumping into each other at the door of paradise, and with Powell telling Barnes that he's come to the wrong place. Thy reward is burning fire, thy travail was none other, but against Holy Church's mother. The fictitious Barnes replies with words that I think, as time is getting on, I shall end with and use as his epitaph. No, truly thou dost not say. Full busy I have been, God's word so pure and clean as it hath been well seen, to open night and day. Thank you.
I'll move this off. We'll just grab a couple of chairs up here, and we have some time for some Q&A. Oh, we can just leave them up on this one. And Peter has a microphone that he'll take around for us, just in case everybody, so everybody can hear. Just get my cords out of the way. Professor X, that was an absolutely wonderful journey through the early 1500s, and just remarkable, I think. As I was reflecting on your words and your comments, just thinking more and more about being in the physical place that these things happened. And also one of the things that I think is fascinating is in all of this, our relationship, or the relationship between St. Edward's and Trinity Hall, going back to 1446. But the uniqueness of whether we call it a peculiar with a little p, whatever it was, but this church being bequeathed to Clare and Trinity Hall, providing a place or a forum. And we can get into your theory on the white horse. I'm sure there's some historians in here who might disagree with you. But this place providing a forum in which Barnes felt the freedom, whatever his intentions, but had the freedom to preach this type of sermon against the bishops. And I recall in his articles criticizing them for their mitres, and their mitres must have been very, very big or very profoundly ornate or something. But he has a lot of criticism about their mitres and their bishop staffs. So I guess the question then is, or my first question, and then we'll open it up to other questions. If, as we look at Barnes's reply in 1531, so give or take 6 years later, he is not kind of committing any heresy, criticizing the bishops, but not committing anything heretical. I guess the question that I have is what, we can't get in Barnes's mind, but I want to hear your opinion. What do you think Barnes was setting out to do in that sermon? And then I think consequently, why did it have such an effect later on?
Well, I mean, my answer to that, because I've in a sense been thinking about that all week, is that he's trying to open the window of debate. He wants to, he is, I think literally, first of all, he's trying to send out a signal about, I'm sure Fox is right about this report of his conversion. Hitherto he's been the prior of the Austin Friars, absolutely solid Catholic guy. There's no doubt about that. And now, this programmatic use of the word gospel, everyone knows what it means, but it's not heresy to talk about the gospel. And so I think he's inviting, if you like, more private conversations. He's not inviting people to flock to sermons and disputations and make an exhibition of themselves. He's just saying, I'm now one of them as well. And here we are in this place. And I'm fairly sure that the parish priest in 1526 is already a man called Edward Buckingham. That's the priest appointed by Trinity Hall to serve the cure. And he holds the parish for many, many years. And it's notable, his connections with people whose wills or other signs in the town and the university just have little Protestant signals in them. So, it may well be that the priest in charge of this church is also already leaning in that direction. Because it's this guy, Sir Edward, is one of the witnesses to John Puregold's will, which is signed just a year later. So I think what Barnes is doing is sending out signals and still trying to spread the word, as it were, rhizomically. It's spreading through the ground, private connections. Bilney, who'd already won over Latimer, who's won over Barnes, does seem to be the man right at the centre of it, but then they in turn are trying to talk round other people. And of course, because lots of them are all friends, Barnes is a friend of Gardiner's, so you don't necessarily, if you're 60 miles away as Gardiner is, you don't know the rest of the story here. You're thinking, oh, Barnes, he's a decent sort, I'll go and talk to him and we'll soon sort this out. And especially as, Gardiner is responsible ultimately for this church, because he's the master of Trinity Hall. So what goes on here reflects on him. There can't have been a heretical sermon in my parish church. So I think there's a lot of these sort of personal dimensions. So I think what it is it's a way of trying to spread the word in a very hostile environment. It's not a sign that suddenly Cambridge is the evangelical hub and that, we've really got a sort of engine room of change. So that's how I disagree with Fox's reading of it. He's reading it from 30 or 40 years later when he knows who wins. I mean, and just on the second part of that, so why do you think that it was such do you think it was such a profound sermon in the sense of that he goes back later in 1531? Is that more of a political move in terms of him kind of assuaging Henry VIII about... I think that's exactly what he's doing here. I mean, later on in the supplication, the supplication has three parts. One, an address to Henry VIII, really rather like somebody dealing with President Trump today, talking up the power and the genius, and nobody will disagree with you. Then saying, they were just out to get me. This was all perfectly innocent stuff. And at this point, Henry VIII himself is encouraging a critique of clerical aggrandizement because that suits his purpose.
Yeah.
And finally, at the end of that, there's some pretty straight Lutheranism coming down in the final section of the book, where he actually sets out a few theological positions in what is a pretty card-carrying Lutheran way. But, you know, the logic there is very simple. Royal power, anti-clericalism means Lutheranism. Come, you know, invite me for a conversation, open your eyes to this. So I think that's what's going on with the supplication. In the second edition of the supplication in 1534, which he expands, he makes this even clearer.
Yes.
And pretty much explicitly invites Henry, you know, you've taken the first step, come along, finish it off.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. I can ask more questions, but I will open it up to anybody who has questions. Peter has the microphone. He'll come around. Anybody else would like to jump in with any thoughts? Otherwise, I will continue to ask questions. Go ahead, Sam.
Oh, thank you. It's going to be one of those dreaded sort of counterfactuals. Oh, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry, it's going to be one of those dreaded counterfactuals, but given that Barnes seems so instrumental in the sort of Lutheranism in England, and perhaps for the Lutheran moment, without that Lutheran moment, what would the rest have looked like? And therefore, without Barnes, what do you think the history would have looked like?
Yeah, I mean, I'd almost prefer the counterfactual the other way around, which is, you know, had, in a sense, it's the factual, you know, we didn't go that way, nothing happened, but had Henry VIII been a little more flexible in his doctrinal affiliations, had he been able to follow Luther in expelling the doctrine of transubstantiation, which he never really expels from his mind, you know, then might England have become under Henry a Lutheran state? I think the answer to that is probably much more easily than it became a reformed state. Because, you know, like the kingdoms, you know, this is what's going on in the kingdoms of Scandinavia. It just seems an easier path to go down. It's Henry's own, pardon me, strong theological self-confidence and self-belief that means he backs himself against everyone, Luther especially, as it were. You know, but he could have been, you know, if he could move on the papacy, he could move on anything. I think that really is true. You know, it's always easy to account for what happened in history because we know it happened. So it all makes sense. But I think there were alternative paths. And I think you can, what I was trying to show is that Barnes and Cromwell, I think, see that other path and are trying to invite Henry down it. And, you know, I'd almost say, yeah, that was, you know, in political advisor terms, that was the percentage option.
Other questions? One up here. Peter, just one up.
Thank you. I was going to ask about the extent of Protestant opposition in Cambridge to the divorce itself. You know, perhaps Anabaptist, perhaps not Anabaptist. What did it look like? Did it cause a division within the Protestant circles in Cambridge?
As far as I can tell, no. The Henry VIII's divorce is seized upon by the evangelicals to a man. So it divides the conservatives. So you get, you know, John Fisher absolutely supporting the Queen. You get Stephen Gardiner absolutely supporting the King. So the Catholic Party is divided by this. But every Protestant in England that I know of, Edward Croom, Barnes, Hugh Latimer, Thomas Cranmer, Edward Fox, Nicholas Shaxton, you can just go down the line, and they all back the King absolutely on the divorce. And excuse me, I've got to haven't talked quite so intensely for quite a while. think part of the reason for that, and part of the reason for their irritation with Luther over his failure to see the point, is that the king's case is envisaged in terms of an appeal to the Word of God, to Scripture. Both the case for the divorce and the case for the supremacy are presented by the king and his advisors as this is what Scripture tells us to do. So it's very easy, I think, for someone with the evangelical inclination, therefore, to go with the king on this. What's fascinating is that William Tyndale, outside the country, doesn't. He opposes the divorce as well, and so does Luther. They oppose it perhaps slightly different reasons, but I think the key there is they're not really in touch with the situation, and they don't see if I'd been advising Luther in the early 1530s, I'd have said, run with this, run with this. And I am sure that if Luther had backed Henry VIII on the divorce, I think Henry VIII would have been much more willing to give an ear to his theological predilections, But again, it is a terribly sort of trashy comparison, but the character resemblances between the current President of the United States and the first Supreme Head of the Church of England are not negligible. So, if you approached Henry the right way, you could, with the right sort of thing, you could elicit within reason the right sort of response from him. And there are limits.
Can I ask just a follow-up question on that?
Yes.
To what extent do you think that actually a united Reformed movement effectively, so you're talking about Lutheranism, the Church of England, perhaps the Calvinists as well, but to what extent would you say that was actually impeded by this kind of theological principledness? In some ways you're saying Henry VIII wasn't going to move on transubstantiation. Mm-hmm. Luther wasn't going to move on the divorce question. So is there almost something built in, even at the start of the Reformation, amongst Protestants, of complete inflexibility on certain theological questions that prevents...
the thing is, theological inflexibility is the currency of the time. It's after all, not just... it's not just Luther or Zwingli or Henry VIII who's theologically inflexible, it's also John Eck and Thomas More and John Fisher who are, they have a much more innocent sense of right and wrong and true and false than I think it's easy for us to have 500 years later when, we can see so many more complexities in things. Thanks to simply to the greater experience that's been accumulated and reflected on. So I don't think there's anything especially unusual in that. In a sense, the big division in the Reformation, the really big division was between the sort of Lutheran axis or group, or the Lutheran stream, and the Reformed Swiss Rhineland stream. Then off beside that there was the Baptist stream, which was very much smaller. But these, in England, that Lutheran Reformed division was something that England's Protestants or evangelicals try not to see and try to minimize. So John Fox is always kind of trying to just smooth away doctrinal wrinkles that crumple the sort of pure sheet of his book. That we're all in this together is Fox's message. And it tends to be the predominant English attitude. And when overseas theologians like Butzer and Peter Martyr and Paul Fagius come to England in Edward's reign, they too are sort of caught up in this sort of slightly ecumenical, slightly fuzzier version of Protestantism, but it doesn't affect the big cheeses of the Reformation in Wittenberg and Jena and Zwingli and Geneva. And so in the end, even the Church of England is kind of forced to take its choice under Elizabeth and broadly stands with the Reformed stream. And, Lutherans get marginalized away. And I have a private opinion that Lutheranism, as a sort of theological solution, is so intensely dependent on the rhetoric of Luther and indeed the German of Luther's German New Testament, that it's almost unexportable in the end. Henry might have been able to disprove that, but every Lutheran solution in Europe is in a German-speaking or a Germanic-speaking polity. Germany itself, the Austrian area, the German-speaking cities of Eastern Europe, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, it's always, you don't really need to translate Luther in order to read him. Whereas in England, France, Italy, Spain, you need to translate Luther to understand him. And Luther doesn't seem to translate, is my ultimate conclusion. But that's very speculative. You can't prove that. It's just an opinion, a mere opinion.
Any other questions? We got one more here.
Thank you. I hadn't realised that Barnes had gone over and there was a little bit of a sort of diplomatic connection between England and Luther. And so I wondered, why wasn't Luther more eager to press on that? Henry VIII would be quite a good prize for the Reformation. As I understand it, he was sometimes able to soften for the sake of expediency, like when he comes back from the castle I've forgotten the name of, and he stops being Junker George and all that. Why not lean into that and maybe be a bit more pliable?
I see exactly your point and would agree. I think it's partly that Luther isn't that political a fellow. So I think he will always privilege truth over pragmatism. That's what Luther is. So I'm just trying to retrieve the fullness of that question. The Barnes and the diplomacy, the man who's really studied the diplomatic interchange between Henry VIII and the Schmalkaldic League, the political organization that represented Lutherans in Germany, is a man called Rory McInteggart, who produced a book on Henry VIII and the League of Schmalkalden. It came out about 20 years ago, and that really sets everything out. Barnes, worth saying, early on he's an unofficial diplomat, but actually after a while he gets accreditation. He becomes actually an ambassador, which means that theoretically he's a KC. He is a king's counsellor, because anyone who is sent abroad as an ambassador in those days is sworn of the king's council. And it doesn't mean a privy councillor, but you've got that status. So, Barnes is on the very edge of the big time in the mid-1530s, but the situation doesn't go his way. So why doesn't Luther see it? I think it's, he's, like Henry VIII, he has enormous self-belief, especially in theology. So I think that's partly it. One is taken back to Marburg, and is it 1528? Steve, I think it's 1528, the fist on the table, chalk circle, hoc est corpus meum. What bit of this don't you understand? Is his answer to Zwingli and Karlstadt and all the rest of the reformers who disagree with him. He's perfectly happy to be the one man marching in step. And I think that counts in the debates with Henry VIII as well. But the book that Mark mentioned, sort of Henry VIII and Luther, what was it, the second controversy, was precisely Luther in the mid-1520s, persuaded by a false rumour. This is actually before Barnes has preached. In May 1525, Luther writes a letter to Henry VIII saying, Dear King, I hear you're becoming favourably inclined to the gospel. If there's anything I can do to jolly this along, please do tell, because I will actually eat all those nasty words I said to you in 1523 when you wrote against me. You know, it really is, for Luther, quite an accommodating and reconciling letter. But of course, what he gets back from Henry VIII is another smack round the head from the king, who writes this second little book against him, in which he makes, by the way, that comment about papal authority. You know, so it may also be that Luther felt he'd tried it once and it hadn't worked. There may be, I think we mustn't ever overlook in history that dimension of personal antagonism or personal amity that can affect so many things.
Excellent. All right, I have one last question, and then we will invite everybody. We have some wine and nibbles over there. But I guess the last question I have is kind of getting back to this connection with Trinity Hall. We talked about Bilney's conversion of Latimer, and this being called Latimer's pulpit. So because of his preaching here at St. Edward's, presumably Bilney preached here. I know there's question as to whether Cranmer ever came over and preached. So who knows? But why do you think it was Barnes who was instigated? Because certainly Latimer, I mean, at least some of the works that I've read, that, you know, he was very critical of the Catholic Church at the time, or the Church's practices at the time. Maybe not so hypercritical of the bishops themselves, but was saying things against kind of the status quo as it was in the church.
I mean, I think it's partly, you know, there's evidently some personal animus between Barnes and Preston, you know, and probably Ridley as well. Barnes makes this clear. Ridley sees himself as bearing the torch for his cousin, the Bishop of London, and indeed, you know, one of the revealing things Barnes says in his supplication is, you know, Ridley's, when they were actually having the argument in what is now the old schools in front of the Vice-Chancellor, Ridley says, yeah, this kind of preaching against the bishops is in principle fine, but where were the bishops? They're not here. So what are you playing at? You know, so he's kind of saying, you know, this is a bit disingenuous. This is his line to Barnes. You know, you're saying you're doing this moral reform thing to an audience which is not in the room. So what good does that do? So he has he's taking the political view. And Barnes is, after all, a preaching friar. You know, the friars are the popular preachers of the time. With Latimer, I think, you know, although it's not till 1529 that we can actually document Latimer coming out in public and testing the water. I'm sure his conversion is earlier than that, but actually he doesn't step out, and it may well be that what happened to Barnes probably deters people. I would have thought from, you know, 2 years in prison or in close confinement is not something most people relish. And finally, why does Barnes's sermon get a special attention? Not least because, you know, those articles of his are obviously aimed in particular at Cardinal Wolsey. And Cardinal Wolsey is a very big man to go and kind of punch on the nose. Again, Barnes makes it clear he's summoned before Wolsey himself during this period in London. And he says, there are 25 articles. He says, there are 2 that bothered Wolsey, and one of them was the one about the mitres, and the other was the one about big gold crucifixes and crosses. So that was all that bothered Wolsey, the stuff that touched him. So again, a little bit Trumpish, as it were. But if you're going to do that sort of thing in Wolsey's England, it's probably better not to make Wolsey himself one of the targets.
Yes. Excellent, excellent. Well, can we thank Professor Rex once more once again.